The figure of the enemy is important in any society. The main feature in creating enemies is to provide them with an identity based on the opposition between those who belong to a specific group and those who do not. The enemy is always different. Actually, they're much worse than the members of a specific group. In particular, the enemy is ugly, deformed, and ignorant. They smell and are aggressive. Enemies come in handy in periods of crisis and difficulties, but even in prosperous periods we need enemies. Having an enemy also reinforces the power of the government. In fact, as enemies unite people as groups, they enhance patriotism and the feeling of belonging. Enemies are not created by a group of people, but by those who hold power. In fact, they need to control the people in the group against a common aim. Apparently, we cannot get rid of enemies, no matter how civilized or peaceful we consider ourselves. After the Second World War, Italy didn't have to deal with external enemies, but with the internal ones. There were lots of differences between the south and the north of the country. Those who left the south in search of a job in the north had to suffer the wrath of those who lived there. They were considered inferior in their own country, slaves in their own nation. Southern immigrants often found signs at the entrance of public places like "Dogs and Southerners are not allowed." In those years, the word terrone was very common in northern speech. People from Milan, Turin, or Venice couldn't stand Southerners. They saw them as enemies because they didn't share their culture. Most of them were extremely poor, and they belonged to a lower social class. At that time, the two most important political parties were the Italian Communist Party, PCI, and the Christian Democracy, DC, who were constantly in conflict. Both parties created their own specific enemies. The Christian Democrats were seen by the Communists as a modern succhione, a rich and greedy capitalists. They had claws instead of hands, and drool dripped from their mouth, as they were always getting richer and richer. In the 1980s, political parties called Leghe started to become very popular in northern Italy. They gave voice to the crisis of ideals between the Western and communist world. The political leaders of the Lega Nord pretended they would defend local northern Italian communities and their identity from the pressure of globalization. They created two different images of their enemy, the internal ones and the external ones. The most important internal enemy was Rome, the main seat of political power in the country. They used to call the city Roma Ladrona, Rome like a thief. They still do. There were also external enemies, like immigrants. They mostly came from Africa, and they arrived in our country in big boats, and they were a threat to the culture and traditions of northern Italy. During the Second World War, there were two important representations of the enemy, the external enemy and the internal enemy. So, the external frontier versus the internal frontier. People who were not fighting were accused of not caring for those who were risking their lives. The Soviet Union is portrayed as an absolute chaos. Every person can be arrested by the Red Guards, who are drinking vodka, playing dice, and hitting people who protest because they want food. The enemy is stereotyped as a monster, the typical green monster who is wearing glasses, like the ex-commander of the Red Army during the Revolution. It represents Bolshevism. Jews were also identified as enemies and were portrayed with deformed features. In this picture, we can see the future of Italy if the US wins the war. Uncle Sam has his hand on the globe to highlight the American power.
Nella grande metropoli di un'isola lontana che si allunga sul mare come un grosso ragno dagli immani tentacoli, c'era un sinistro castello, dimora di ombre e di fantasmi, popolato dai più ripugnanti animali notturni. nel tetro maniero, viveva nascosto agli occhi del mondo uno strano essere che aveva dell'uomo e del mostro. Egli nella sua cupa solitudine ammassava incapaci forzieri tutto l'oro della terra che le sue mani adunche andavano arraffando dappertutto con bestiale egoismo. Una botola portava nel sotterraneo più segreto del castello, dove il mostro disponeva di un misterioso laboratorio d'alchimia. Lì dentro, ogni qualvolta egli voleva presentarsi agli esseri umani, si preparava una certa bevanda, miscuglio dei più allettanti ma pericolosi ingredienti, che gli permettevano di trasformarsi miracolosamente. E il gioco è fatto.
Poco dopo l'Italia combatte in terra di Spagna contro il bolscevismo che assalta la civiltà cristiana e che minaccia di crearsi una base nell'ovest europeo.
Manifestos of the beginning of the 20th century. Here we can see people literally feeding their leaders according to cartoons published on socialist newspapers, which drew upon widely shared feelings. In 1911, the main external enemy for the Italians are the Turks. In fact, the Italians wanted to colonize Libya and Rodi, which belonged to the Turks. In the first picture, we can see Turks represented as half an animal, half a man. The second, the Turkish is a centaur armed with a bow and arrow. The internal enemy for the Italians was the Italian Socialist Party, which was the only European socialist party against the war. This is the reason why the Italian socialists were thought to be allied with the Triple Alliance. Here we can see another example of the external enemy, the Germans, who were thought cruel. In the first picture, they are killing Russians, while in the second picture, Germany is represented as a vampire who sucks the world's blood. The construction of the enemy is a process that has a long history. For many centuries, the common European enemy was Judas. He was characterized by the same traits we saw before. He was ugly, he was deformed, and he was mostly black. This depiction, as we can see, comes from the ancient times. The Greeks were the founders of this process. We can see how they depicted their common enemies, which they called barbarians, in a different way. They were always dressed in a certain way, and they were naturally slaves, naturally cowards, and naturally without any masculinity. They were completely not manly. The Greeks were also the founders of the concept of monsters. Monsters were used as a sort of catalyzation of fear, to spread fear among the population of these terrible enemies that lived just after their borders. Also, the Romans used this particular concept. They used it to depict their common enemies, like the Gauls, the Germans, and the Carthaginians, in the same way. They were all very courageous but highly stupid. They were mean, and they were pretty good liars. They were also bestial and feral. They were also all dressed in a certain way, with leotard prints. What can be viewed as a common enemy today by many